From the land of caliphs, scholars, jinn and turquoise domes, among the treasures that 1,000 desert dunes hide, Hona Baghdad, Hona al-Arab. Hey everyone, welcome to Hona al-Arab, which roughly translates to Here Are Arabs or Here Be Arabs. Now, before we get to the first episode, let me introduce myself and the podcast. Hona al-Arab will hopefully be a dual language podcast about the Arab and Islamic world. The plan is that we'll visit a different Arab or Islamic city around the world each week or so and talk about some part of that city's culture, be it an idea, person, or physical space. Originally, I was going to restrict our reach to Arab cities only, but it would be such a disservice to the international reach of Arab culture if I went through with that. So, Islamic aid is getting thrown into the bunch. Now, I'm going to try my complete best to fact check everything twice, comb through trustworthy sources and reference them in the description, so that everything that I say is backed up in some way or another, but of course, no one's perfect. So if any of you guys find an error in something that I say, please let me know. Also, small note, I'm not exactly planning to have any fake enthusiasm and inject it into this podcast. I find that both unnecessary and really annoying. Oh, and one more thing before we dive in. The pen name that I'll be using, if you will, is the Kufiya columnist, and as with how newspaper columns are, I'll be sharing some of my opinions at some point. But I'll try to still remain as objective as journalistic integrity demands when talking about facts. Also, please feel free to suggest a topic for any future episodes with a comment or email. And one minor note, if you don't know what a kufiya is, the kufiya is the original name for the Arabic shawl that they we tie around their heads or put around their shoulders or use in a different variety of ways. It's usually known as the red checkered scarf or the black checkered scarf, though different color variations exist. Now that that's out of the way, Bismillah. Let's talk Baghdad. The city has seen better days. Their current state is honestly tear-worthy. That being said, it wasn't always like this. At some point in time, dear listener, Baghdad was the largest city on earth. All the world's roads led to her, everyone wanted to be there, and anyone who was there never wanted to leave. I could go on and on talking about how incredible Baghdad is, and I will, but I want to explore a specific part of her history, a microcosm of her greatness, if you will. The House of Wisdom, or Bayt al-Hikmah. But for that, we'll need some historical background. 15 years before the first brick of her walls was laid, the Abbasid family came out of Khorasan with black flags and an incredible army filled with Arabs, Persians, and other Muslim minorities, ready to topple the Umayyad dynasties to hold over the Islamic world. This wasn't some minor rebellion a la Zind's rebellion in Basra that was going to be put down easily. No, the Umayyad had finally run their course after conquering lands from the shores of the Iberian Peninsula to the steppes of Central Asia. I won't go into great detail about why and how this happened, but suffice to say, favoritism and decadence brought them down. 13 years before Baghdad's Golden Dome was constructed, Abu al-Abbas Abdullah Safah became the first Abbasid caliph. His midnight banner was soon planted in every corner of the caliphate's lands, and his name was invoked in every Friday prayer. But the story starts with the second caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Al-Mansur wanted a completely fresh start, and so naturally the man moved the caliphate's capital from Damascus to Mesopotamia, closer to his Khorasani homeland. He chose to side a bit further away from Sasani and Sasfon, where the Tigris and Euphrates were practically touching, and built a city first called Dar Al-Salam, or the Abode of Peace, but now eternally, nostalgically, and mournfully called Baghdad. The location was strategic for a ton of reasons. It being near Sasfon meant that Baghdad was practically built on the literal crossroads of popular trade routes, which, coupled with the easy transport access the rivers gave, meant the city had a near infinite supply of people, ideas, and materials. At her peak, the city was a metropolis. It eclipsed nearly every other city on the planet. But don't take my word for it. Let's read this account from a historian who actually visited Baghdad during her zenith. His name was Yaqut al-Hamawi. He was a Byzantine Greek Muslim, and this is what he said about the Caliph city. Quote, "A city of Baghdad formed two vast semicircles on the right and left banks of the Tigris, 12 miles in diameter. The numerous suburbs covered with parks, gardens, villas, and beautiful promenades, and beautifully supplied with the rich bazaars, finely built mosques, and baths, stretched for a considerable distance on both sides of the river. In the days of her prosperity, the population of Baghdad and its suburbs amounted to over 2 million. The palace of the caliph stood in the midst of a vast park several hours in circumference, which besides a menagerie and an aviary comprised an enclosure for wild animals reserved for the chase. The palace grounds were laid out with gardens and adorned with exquisite taste with plants, flowers, and trees, reservoirs and fountains, surrounded by sculpted figures. On this side of the river stood the palaces of the great nobles, immense streets, no less than 40 cubits wide, traversed the city from one end to the other, dividing it into blocks or quarters, each under the control of an overseer or supervisor, who looked after the cleanliness, sanitation, and the comfort of its inhabitants. Mind you, this isn't the desert. For miles and miles you find sand, rocks, bandits, and wild animals, and then the closer you get to some greenery and a river, you find yourself in a literal paradise oasis. To put this in a somewhat reductionist and orientalist manner, London's population at the time would have been able to comfortably fit in one of Baghdad's several districts, and we would still have some leftover space. When Londoners were trudging through mud, Baghdad had a wooden robot playing music floating above the Tigris. Naturally, a city this incredible would attract virtually anyone and everyone who could travel to it, and so it did. Scholars, merchants, scribes, warriors, craftsmen, nobles, peasants, and really everyone in between wanted to go to Baghdad. This started the second phase of the Abbasids' plan for the city. Now that their capital was complete materially, it was time for her to flourish intellectually and socially. Hey y'all, quick intermission. Make sure to subscribe, follow, or whatever the equivalent is on whatever platform you're listening to support the podcast. Thank you, and back to our regularly scheduled programming. Okay, so we finally get to the House of Wisdom. Kind of. See, the building of Baghdad and what the city was like was the only really concrete part that we know for sure. The information regarding the House of Wisdom is a bit murky. For one, we're not exactly sure who built it or when. Now, some attribute it to Al-Mansur, saying it expanded out his own private library. We'll get more into that in a bit. Others date its creation to Harun al-Rashid's reign. The most famous of the Abbasid caliphs, who was also immortalized in Shahrazad's Alf Layla wa Layla tales, or 1001 Arabic Nights for you guys. A weaker opinion says the house creation even later to the reign of the controversial Al-Ma'mun, but that would conflict with some earlier historical accounts. Now, this frustrating uncertainty extends the name too. Whereas now it's known universally as Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, certain contemporaries of it called it Dar Al-Hikmah or Khizanat al-Hikmah, the abode of wisdom and the closet of wisdom respectively. The prevailing theory is that it started as Al-Mansur's private library, an extension of his palace, as was the norm at the time. But then at some point, the book collection got so big that it needed to be taken elsewhere, so it was then moved to the banks of the Tigris. Alright then. So what did this ever-elusive House of Wisdom actually look like? Honestly, it was very hard to find something solid about this. A scholar called Mahmoud Ahmed Darwish, through researching Al-Mansur's Golden Palace, found a pretty decent description of it. His source was called Tarikh al-Jami'at al-Islamiyya al-Kubra, or the History of Great Islamic Universities. It's a Moroccan book written in 1953. Now, though I do think that labeling it as a university might be imposing our own conceptions of what a higher educational institute is, or should be, this is the one good source I found. Quote, the House of Wisdom composed of a yard surrounded by halls of 2 floors from its 4 sides. It was headed by a penthouse on a row of pillars. In the middle of every side among the 4 sides of the yard, there were halls topped by semi-cylindrical domes of 25 cubits. The main hall leads to a square-shaped room. Above it, there was a big dome with 80 cubits high. The main hall also had a statue of a knight holding a spear that spins with the spear. The ground floor contained a number of divisions for book closets and sections for translating, authoring, copying, binding, reading, as well as studying in all subjects of knowledge, sciences, and literature. As for the upper floor, it was devoted to residents from authors, translators, students, and employees. A spear-wielding giant knight sounds a bit metal, no? Now, this description looks a bit close to what the Al-Mustansariya University now looks like in Baghdad. It still survives to our day, though it was built way later after the creation date of the House of Wisdom. And it is also missing the giant metal spear-wielding knight, which is a big downside, to be honest. So this is the building, and as cool as it may have been, what happened inside is what we were actually interested in. So what did happen there, and why was it, and is it still such a big deal? Well, here's the first misnomer or misunderstanding about the Islamic Golden Age and the House of Wisdom that we encounter. Neither was really the work of Muslims or Arabs exclusively. Though the work was used in an Islamic context, revolutionizing Islamic theology and philosophy, and was written in Arabic, it was more international than you might think. For starters, Jews, Christians, and others worked alongside Muslims and contributed heavily, particularly in the translation efforts that happened inside the Institute's walls. The translation movement is probably the best place to start with the House of Wisdom, as it kickstarted everything. It started with more pragmatic texts like ancient Greek and Indian medical manuscripts, but soon it expanded into everything under the sun, from philosophy and astronomy to mathematics and chemistry. This not only transformed Arabic into a lingua franca of the time, particularly in the sciences and philosophy, it also gave rise to figures like Sibawayh and al-Farahidi, who essentially literally wrote the books on Arabic grammar. Again, despite it being started by Muslims and largely funded to the caliphs, the translation movement was not exclusive. In fact, the man who spearheaded the movement was Hunayn bin Ishaq, a Christian Arab who was later called the Sheikh of Translators. Now, despite the caliph's attempts, Hunayn remained a Christian, which I think, more than anything, is a testament to how inclusive that era was. See, the man in charge of the literal House of Wisdom's biggest movement, the translation, was a Christian and was not pressured onto becoming a Muslim, even though he was incentivized to, sorry. Despite all the props and attention I'm giving the translation movement, let's not fall into an incredibly cliche reading of history here. Yes, Muslims and Co. did translate a ton of works, which made them available for the Europeans later to use to jumpstart their own renaissance, but it would be an incredible lie to stop there. And unfortunately, this has been a very popular narrative, even if it's very misleading. No, Baghdad did more than translate. She wasn't some glorified archivist. She commented, expanded, and improved on literally everything. Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi took up Aristotle's text and started their own schools of philosophy, who were then further developed by their students. The Musa brothers built proto-robots in the form of water clocks, the aforementioned river musician, and an automatic prayer alarm. Hell, they authored a book called Kitab al-Hiyal, or the Book of Ingenious Devices, that had intricate instructions on how to build many contraptions, including the robotics. Ibn al-Haytham refuted ancient conventions about how eyesight worked and laid the foundation for cameras. Ammar bin Ali al-Mawsili created a syringe that allowed him to remove cataracts. This was in the 13th century, people, or even below that. I couldn't really find a date on him. Al-Khwarizmi literally invented algebra and introduced the zero into mainstream mathematics. Even if that was taken from Hindu sources, it still showed that Arabs and Muslims in general were not akin to taking information from people they did not consider Muslims or even people of the book. Also, this openness to knowledge, wherever it came from, extends into fields that are now controversial in the Muslim world. Al-Jahaz wrote down one of the earliest accounts of the theory of evolution anywhere ever. And this is all talking about people who were exclusively in Baghdad. Imagine, we still had people in Basra, in Mosul, in Cairo, in Al-Andalus, where the streets there were already paved and had oil light lamps hanging on the streets. I could go on, but you get the idea. The notion that the Islamic Golden Age was nothing more than a glorified archive for Europeans to discover at some point is deeply troubling and showcases a very, very poor understanding of history. Frankly, and how science and the human nature work at all. Refuting this narrative is annoying for several reasons, but it mainly bugs me because it further entrenches the idea that the East must in some way justify itself and its actions in a Western framework. It somehow puts the Eastern identity into a vacuum where it only exists as a counter to Western ideas or Western claims. Now, I'm going to get into Orientalism and what Edward Said said and whether that's right or not. This is a topic that I'm sure we'll visit later on, but for now, just know I loathe reactionary ideologies. Anyway, this newfound knowledge was cheaper to reproduce than ever too. See, the Abbasids continued the Umayyads' trend of conquering areas, and they even reached China. During one of their wars with the Chinese Empire at the time, they managed to acquire some Chinese slaves, or, well, soon-to-be slaves, but there were soldiers at the time. Now, they ransomed these soldiers' freedom by telling them, if you teach us how to create this cheap, reproducible paper, we'll let you go. And they did, which is how the first paper-making business flourished in Baghdad. This allowed books to be made and distributed at a fraction of the old cost. Despite this economical change, all of the movement around the Islamic Golden Age, really, and the House of Wisdom sounds really expensive. And it was. But there was never a shortage of capital. Isn't that weird? I'll tell you exactly why. Firstly, the caliphs pumped an almost unlimited amount of money into translations, commentary, and research. Scholars really had no bills to worry about. No accommodation, food, service, or anything. They were completely freed up to do the work and do what they do best. But of course, the government only has so much money to give. So what really happened? Well, when you live in a place where knowledge is so prized, naturally the wealthy seek to gain in some way. Thankfully in Baghdad, a rich man's ego was boosted by sponsoring scholars. Baghdad's aristocrats, nobles, merchants practically competed with each other to fund research and translation. In turn, they gained prestige and street cred, coupled with some favor with the caliph, of course. Some people would question this. The motives for them funding the researchers was not purely, altruistic. But frankly, when is anything purely altruistic? I mean, you could still get the benefit of wanting to add some knowledge to the world and still, getting some leeway with the caliph in some way. Anyway, this research was also useful for economical reasons, of course. It wasn't just, for the sake of knowledge. More advancements in every field, people were able to generate better everything. From medicine, musical instruments, literature, urban planning, irrigation, very importantly because of the desert climate they lived in. They also did economics. I mean, in theory and in practice, the more money Baghdadis gave to education, the more wealth they made. A golden circle that mirrored the Mesopotamian paradise that birthed it. How stories tell that some translators, like Hunayn, were paid the weight of the books they translated in gold. Now, that is an incredible notion because today, most people in the Arab world or the Eastern world, let's say, want their sons to grow up to be, doctors or engineers or whatever. But at that time, you could tell your son to become a translator or go into something more related to the humanities, and he would be still paid as on par, with doctors and the engineers at the time. This showed a somewhat circular plan of how knowledge was dealt in Baghdad. The more prized the knowledge producers were, the scholars, the more people wanted to go into that, and then the more that fed into the prized notion of knowledge and education in general. It's incredible when you think about it. However, the House of Wisdom influenced more than its own production, though. The same competition that was flourishing within Baghdad extended to other places and the Islamic world. Now, libraries and institutions like the House of Wisdom were cropping up in Fatimid Egypt, Aghlabid North Africa, and Umayyad Iberia. Caliphs, sultans, and even warlords were competing with each other with blades and quills to see whose realm would outdo the other. God, that must have been such a sight to see. But, regretfully, every fairy tale, every myth has its ending. Baghdad's was no difference. Due to civil wars, rebellions, poor governing, and competing dynasties, the Abbasid Caliphate slowly deteriorated over its 500-year reign. I won't go into much heart-wrenching detail, so we skip to the end. 1258. The Mongol menace, headed by Hulagu, reaches Baghdad. After a protest from last Caliph al-Mustaslim, Baghdad was sacked. No one was spared. For days, the Tigris and Euphrates ran red with the blood of scholars first, and then black with the ink of books thrown in it. Stories tell that the Mongols even used books for stables for their horses. Something needs to be said though. The catastrophe didn't exactly cause what most people think it did. The Great Decline thesis that was widely accepted regarding Muslim civilization is a bit reductive. The progress Muslims made in sciences did slow down considerably because of what happened to Baghdad, but it didn't stop altogether, and it did pick up later on. See, the precedent set by the Abbasids and their mythical city extended further than its walls. So when Baghdad fell, 1,000 other ones rose and continued to shine for hundreds of years. We can see this in the incredible astrological tradition that the Muslims left. That's just one facet of it. That's not to speak of urban planning and continued desert irrigation and military tactics and architecture and the arts and culture and music and literature. It's incredible what you can miss on if you decided to accept that the mythical golden age of Islam was somehow in black or white. It was a switch that was either turned on or turned off. But of course, that's a story for another day. This was a very, very, very brief excerpt of Baghdad's history and the House of Wisdom. I try to summarize it in a way because no one has time these days. I'll probably do some more longer form content that goes into more detail about the actual processes inside the House of Wisdom at some point. And of course, there's always so much more to be said. And one day we'll perhaps revisit the seat of the Caliphate and the billion tales within it that are waiting to be told. But for today, that's all. That's all I have. Fi aman Allah, everyone.